I will decide. The king will say only what I allow. The chilling sentence echoed from a leaked recording, like a cold blade slicing through the secretive atmosphere of Buckingham Palace. Moments later, the scene shifted to a closed meeting room, where even the century-old walls seemed to tremble under the invisible force tightening its grip on the British royal family. A question slipped out from someone's mouth, filled with fear and disbelief. How can someone who is not the king control the entire British monarchy? No one answered, because the answer, perhaps everyone already knew, but no one dared to speak aloud. Camilla was manipulating the king. The advisors were silent. Charles was growing weaker. The firmness he once possessed now reduced to nothing more than a faint shadow behind the powerful woman who was steadily taking over every key position. And in that suffocating atmosphere, there was only one person who dared to stand up and confront her directly: Princess Anne. Dark rumors began spreading through the palace about the second center of power, the woman whom guards whispered about, saying that the king's decisions were no longer his own. Some even claimed they had witnessed Camilla scolding Charles right inside the private chambers, an image disturbing enough to send chills down the spine of anyone devoted to the monarchy. So what made a seasoned princess like Anne willing to step into such a dangerous confrontation? And how did she manage to shake the entire Privy Council? To understand this, we must trace back to the earliest signs of Camilla's unsettling influence over King Charles. From the moment Camilla stepped into the role of queen consort, those working inside the palace felt a subtle shift creeping through the ancient hallways. No one said it aloud, but their eyes told the story that the balance of power within the British monarchy was beginning to tilt in an unusual direction. And that shift became unmistakably visible every time King Charles appeared alongside Camilla, especially during major diplomatic events. The beginning of that imbalance was during the visit of the King of Sweden, where a shocking moment was captured by several cameras. Charles was speaking with King Carl XVI, Gustav, about a cultural cooperation program. Before Charles could finish, Camilla abruptly cut in. But what left everyone frozen was not the interruption itself, but the words she uttered right after. Words not only harsh, but deeply insulting to the head of the British monarchy. Camilla tilted her head, looked straight at Charles, and spoke in a voice so even it was chilling. "Charles, do not talk about things you do not understand." Time seemed to stop. The King of Sweden raised an eyebrow. The guest politely looked away, pretending not to hear. The British courtiers turned pale, some stepping back, others trying to maintain a neutral expression while their fingers clenched tightly together. No one dared to speak, because they all knew that anyone who intervened would provoke Camilla's anger and unleash a chain of unpredictable consequences. Though the moment lasted only seconds, its echo extended far beyond that evening's banquet. Some later admitted they had never seen any queen consort speak to a king in such a manner. But what was even more disturbing was Charles's reaction. He stood there, frozen, his eyes flickering with confusion like a man trying to remember what he had done wrong. There was no defense, no sign of royal dignity, only an elderly man desperately trying not to worsen the mood of the woman beside him. That incident was only the beginning of a series of increasingly clear signs that Camilla was overshadowing King Charles entirely. And it became even more apparent during a charity event in London, where the king was supposed to simply visit and speak with guests. But everything unfolded in a way no one expected. Inside the temporary kitchen set up for the event, Camilla handed Charles an apron and instructed him to ladle soup for guests like a service worker. Witnesses said they were utterly shocked to see the king standing behind the counter, head lowered, ladling soup one scoop at a time and placing it on trays. No one understood why a man who held the highest authority in a constitutional monarchy would let himself fall into such a position, but the answer was obvious right in front of them. Charles did not do it because of protocol or obligation. He did it because Camilla told him to. An employee who was present that day said that when Camilla walked past, Charles glanced at her with a look of quiet expectation, as if only with her nod would he be allowed to step away from the counter. That image sent chills through those who had served generations of kings, because they understood that there had never been any precedent for a monarch needing his wife's permission during a public engagement. Her dominance did not stop at charity events or diplomatic activities. It seeped into every moment of royal life, even into ceremonies where every gesture had been standardized by centuries of tradition. On another occasion, at the unveiling of a portrait in a major museum, Charles stood before the red curtain, his hand on the pull cord but not drawing it down. Cameras captured clearly the moment he turned toward Camilla, waiting for a signal. Only when Camilla slightly raised her chin did Charles pull the cord to reveal the portrait. That moment circulated widely within the royal household, and many saw it as the clearest proof of the king's dependency on Camilla. A monarch does not need to look at advisors, does not need to follow cues, yet he waited for his wife's eyes to know what he should do. Stories like this began spreading throughout the inner palace, told by anonymous staff members. They said that Charles was corrected by Camilla every day, and that it happened so openly that no one even found it surprising anymore. Some recalled that Camilla could scold Charles right in front of the household staff, sometimes over the smallest matters, such as him giving responses in the wrong order during a scheduled briefing, or failing to remember the name of someone he had met. A long-serving bodyguard, who had worked for several senior royals, confided in secrecy that he had never seen any monarch who needed permission from anyone before making a decision, no matter how small, but with Charles it happened every single day. The bodyguard said with quiet bewilderment that just by looking at Charles's eyes whenever Camilla walked into a room, one could understand that the balance of power within the family had shifted long ago. What made the situation even more unsettling was not just the way Camilla dominated Charles, but the fact that the king seemed to accept it naturally. Gone was the crown prince who once fiercely defended his love for Camilla. Gone was the man who fought against the press, against his family, and even against tradition to live his life his own way. In his place stood an aging man surrounded by dependency and an unnamed fear, always trying desperately to please his wife. Meanwhile, those close to the royal household began to sense that Camilla did not only aim to influence Charles, but also intended to control key decisions inside the palace machinery, from scheduling assignments, coordinating events, to personnel arrangements. Camilla's hands seemed to appear everywhere. This made many worry that the British monarchy was being steered not by its rightful leader, but by the person standing beside him. All these images and stories accumulated into a quiet pressure within the palace, like embers smoldering inside an old fireplace, waiting for a strong gust of wind to ignite into a roaring fire. And the one who blew that wind was none other than Princess Anne. Anne had always been reserved, disciplined, and rarely interfered. But when she saw the obvious change in her brother's behavior, when she witnessed the moments Charles bowed his head before Camilla, when she heard the whispers of guards and staff, she understood that the royal family was slipping away from the position it once held. Charles was no longer the one who governed the monarchy. Camilla was the one making the decisions, and Anne knew that if no one spoke up, this imbalance would become a threat to the entire reign. And it was these very images that made Princess Anne realize that the balance of power within the family had been overturned. Princess Anne was not someone who could be subdued by anyone. After decades standing at the center of power, she understood all too well that even the smallest changes in attitude, in a glance or in the behavior of a royal family member, could reveal enormous secrets. And as Camilla's acts of dominance became increasingly obvious, Anne knew she had to intervene. However, before making any decision, she wanted to attempt a direct conversation with the sister-in-law who was pushing the entire palace into unprecedented tension. The meeting took place in a room lined with dark oak, where the light cast from the chandeliers made the atmosphere even more somber. Anne entered with her usual calmness, but her eyes were sharp as cold steel. She began speaking in a slow voice, steady and seasoned with experience. She said that recently she had noticed the heavy strain weighing on her brother, that Charles no longer seemed as confident as before, and that some of Camilla's actions in public had triggered unpleasant whispers. Camilla did not wait for Anne to finish. She leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and gave a cold smile. Then, with an extremely arrogant tone, she cut the conversation short. I know what Charles needs better than anyone. If you are uncomfortable, you may leave. The room fell silent. Those words were not merely a challenge. They were a declaration of territorial control. Camilla was essentially saying she was the only one who had the right to decide anything regarding the king. Anne looked straight at Camilla, her eyes filled with disbelief and disappointment. In that moment, she realized that Camilla was not just loud, nor simply hot-tempered. She was a real threat, a woman grasping royal power with both boldness and unpredictable ambition. After the confrontation, Anne no longer had any doubts. If she did not intervene, Charles would sink further into dependence and weakness. So she began initiating a secret investigation, something no one in the palace had dared to do since the days of Queen Elizabeth II. To ensure absolute secrecy, Anne contacted a former assistant who had served the late queen for many years. This person was not only completely loyal, but also exceptionally astute and deeply knowledgeable about how the royal machinery operated. The investigation began with the smallest details: schedules, documents, transport staff, internal meetings, suspicious expenditures, but very soon larger secrets emerged. The assistant reported that there were financial files that did not match royal regulations at all. Some expenses had been approved under the pretense of royal events, but were in fact redirected to renovation projects belonging to Camilla's private properties. Not only that, for 3 consecutive weeks, there had been secret transport of ancient artworks from the Buckingham archives to Camilla's private residence. When questioned, Camilla's house steward brushed it off, saying that she wanted to preview them before display, but under royal regulations, no one was allowed to move valuable artifacts without written approval from the Privy Council or the monarch. This proved one thing: Camilla had clearly abused her authority. Even more alarming was the list of secret meetings Anne received. In those meetings, Camilla included both her sister and her daughter in strategic discussions about finance, foreign relations, and state representation. Individuals with no official role in the British royal family were sitting in high-level, confidential meetings. This had never happened in modern royal history. Anne listened to every detail, her pen racing across the page. Each piece of evidence revealed only fueled the storm building inside her. She knew that even the slightest mistake during the investigation could have severe consequences, not only from Camilla, but also from those in the palace who had begun shifting to the new queen's side. One evening, while Anne was reviewing the documents, a senior advisor close to Charles came to see her. His face was filled with worry, his hurried steps signaling that he carried something extremely dangerous. He stood at Anne's door, taking a deep breath before daring to speak. "Your Royal Highness, I must tell you this. If you continue this investigation, you will be going against the most powerful person after the king." Anne lifted her head. Her gaze showed no fear, no hesitation. She had grown up with pressure, accustomed to the silent battles within the royal family that the public never knew about. She lowered the documents onto the table, narrowed her eyes slightly, and replied with resolute firmness, "I am not afraid of her. I am only afraid my brother will lose himself." The advisor froze at those words. It was not only a declaration of resolve, it was a silent oath from a sister who prioritized responsibility above all danger. Anne understood that Camilla's power was spiraling beyond control. She knew that if she did nothing, Charles could become a king in title only, controlled by whispers behind palace doors. In the days that followed, Anne continued receiving confidential reports. The scattered pieces gradually formed a complete picture of Camilla's increasingly alarming manipulation. She was not only overstepping her authority, but deliberately building a private power network that included her relatives, her assistants, and those indebted to her. This was no longer personal action. It was a web of influence tightening around the monarchy. Every night, when sitting alone in the large room overlooking the dark garden, Anne would think of Charles. She remembered the image of her brother who used to smile easily, the man who once walked with confidence and spoke with certainty. Now, sputting, he had become only a quiet shadow, always glancing at Camilla before saying a word or making a decision. That made Anne feel heartbroken and furious at the same time. And then, in that tense moment, Anne understood that the time had come for her to make the most dangerous move, a move that could change the entire game. And that was when Anne decided to deliver the most dangerous blow. The atmosphere in the small meeting room of Buckingham Palace that day felt compressed by an invisible force. Every object was arranged with such precision that it seemed the place had been staged to record a moment that no one expected would enter history. On the table, a stack of clean documents was placed neatly. Next to it was a cup of tea that had already gone cold halfway, as if its owner had been too focused on something far more tense. Anne and Sophie had prepared for this moment for weeks. They calculated every second, every glance, every breath, and waited for the perfect moment for the trap to snap shut. The staged meeting was set up like a play, and everyone understood their role. Sophie was at the center of the stage, appearing with the familiar confusion of a woman carrying too much responsibility on her shoulders. She walked into the room as if she had just been forced to handle something impossible. Anne had reminded her to act naturally, not too much, but enough for Camilla to believe this was just an ordinary working session. Sophie placed a thick stack of papers on the table, pretending to study, letting Camilla feel that something was spiraling out of control. Camilla walked in last, like a queen certain of her own power. She sat in the commanding chair at the head of the table, her eyes sweeping quickly over Sophie and the documents in front of her. Just by the way she gripped the armrest, one could see how tightly she controlled everything. Camilla never let anyone see her weakness. She never trusted anyone but herself. And that very confidence was the weakness Anne decided to exploit. Sophie began with a voice trembling just enough. She opened the pile of papers, but made sure her confusion was visible. Camilla raised an eyebrow, as if seeing before her nothing more than a weak woman who did not understand the rules of the palace. Sophie said that the speech for the upcoming event was too difficult and that she did not know what words to use to match the royal tone. Camilla tilted her head, her lips curling into a mocking smile. She put her pen down on the table and asked in an icy voice why someone who had spent so many years in the palace could not handle such a simple task. Sophie intentionally froze. Her hands trembled. Her breathing quickened. All of it was acting exactly according to plan. Because as long as Sophie appeared weak enough, Camilla would lose her temper. And when Camilla lost her temper, she would lose control of her mouth. That was the moment Anne had been waiting for. When Sophie tried to explain that she only wanted to ensure the speech would not cause controversy, Camilla let out a scornful laugh. She leaned back, folded her arms. Then the first sentence left her lips like a blade. If it were not for me, this entire palace would have collapsed long ago. Sophie lowered her head, not out of fear, but because she had to hide the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. That was the first sentence Anne wanted recorded, a self-important, arrogant remark that could shake the image of the queen in the eyes of the public. The recorder hidden inside the small clock on the table had been switched on beforehand. Sophie simply needed to keep Camilla talking. And Camilla, so used to absolute power, suspected nothing. She pretended to flip through the papers faster, creating a bit of noise. She appeared so flustered she seemed on the verge of tears. That very moment pushed Camilla into complete impatience. Camilla leaned forward, her voice lowered but filled with anger. She told Sophie not to overthink things, that everything would go her way as it always had. And then the fateful sentence struck like thunder cracking across a sky thick with tension. He will do as I want, just like always. A few seconds after that sentence, the entire room fell into silence. Sophie felt as if her heart had stopped. She struggled to keep calm, pressing her lips tightly so she would not reveal her true reaction. Because she knew that moment was exactly what Anne had been waiting for. An undeniable proof of Camilla's control over the king. A piece of evidence powerful enough to overturn the entire balance of power. Behind the curtain, Anne stood as still as a statue. Her hand clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Every word Camilla spoke was a stab into the faith she had always placed in the sanctity of the monarchy. Anne was born into discipline, serving the royal family with unconditional loyalty. To witness a woman who did not belong to royal blood manipulating the throne, made Anne feel as though she was facing the collapse of her entire family tradition. Anne leaned forward slightly. She tried to keep her breathing steady, but she could not hide her tension. The recorder had captured exactly the words they needed, but the plan was not finished. Sophie had to guide the conversation to the point where Camilla became suspicious, because that moment of suspicion would be when the trap closed perfectly. Sophie hesitated for a few more beats to make Camilla start feeling irritated. She asked one more naive question, wondering whether the king truly agreed to everything Camilla proposed. Camilla shot her a look sharp as a blade. Her lips tightened, and in that very instant, the entire room seemed to turn ice cold. Camilla lifted her head, her eyes narrowing as she looked around the room as if something was out of place. That moment felt exactly like the climax of a detective film. Every glance from Camilla swept across the dark corners of the room. Sophie held her breath. Anne remained motionless behind the curtain, her heart pounding so loudly she feared Camilla might hear it. Camilla rose from her chair. She took slow steps, one after another. The heels of her shoes striking the floor made a sharp sound that almost caused Sophie to crumble. Camilla looked down at the table, then at the clock, then back at Sophie. A flicker of suspicion flashed in her eyes. But it was already too late. The recorder had everything. Nothing could be undone now. Even if Camilla destroyed the entire room on the spot, the evidence was already in Anne's hands. In that final moment, Sophie bit her lip and endured. Anne gently pushed the curtain aside and stepped out, her eyes colder than ever before. And that was when the transition to the next chapter appeared, like a door opening to a power struggle that could no longer be stopped. With undeniable evidence, Anne stepped into the greatest confrontation of her life. That afternoon, in the deepest meeting chamber of Buckingham Palace, the place where only the most critical decisions of the British monarchy were made, the air hung thick like a low-lying mist. Heavy crimson curtains were drawn shut, and the light from the candles cast shadows on the faces of the Privy Council members, making them look several years older. Everyone knew why they were there, but no one dared to speak. They exchanged glances filled with worry and doubt, as if what was about to happen could shake the foundation of the monarchy itself. The door swung open. Charles entered. The king looked smaller than usual, his shoulders slumped, his tired eyes revealing his confusion. Behind him walked Camilla. She held her chin high, moving with haughty confidence, as though this meeting was nothing more than a trivial interruption. The entire room rose to greet the king, but the silence that followed was so heavy that even breathing felt loud. Charles took the presiding seat. He tried to steady himself and spoke with a hoarse voice. He was waiting for Anne to arrive. When the door opened again and Anne walked in, her face calm but her eyes sharp as a blade, she gently placed a wooden box on the table and sat down. The air in the room stretched tight, as if one wrong movement could tear it apart. A member of the council stood up, stammering as he suggested beginning the session. Anne opened the box and pulled out a small device. No one spoke, but every gaze locked onto her. Then, with absolute composure, Anne pressed the button. Immediately, Camilla's voice filled the sealed room, echoing off the walls like a cold indictment. The familiar voice now sounded brutally arrogant. "I will decide. He will do as I want. Just like always." The room froze. A few people gaped. Another pressed a hand to his chest as if he could not believe what he had just heard. Charles sat motionless, his eyes shut tight, as though opening them would shatter whatever remained of his dignity. Camilla tried to remain composed. She let out a soft laugh and claimed her voice had been edited, but Anne did not allow her to continue. She pressed the button again, and the recording resumed. Even clearer this time, sharper, laying bare all the arrogance hidden behind words never meant for public ears. "If it were not for me, this entire palace would have collapsed long ago." In that instant, Camilla's final mask crumbled. She stiffened. The entire room erupted with whispers that could no longer be contained. One council member turned to the person beside him and said loudly enough for the room to hear, "We have allowed her to go too far." Camilla clenched her hands. Her eyes blazing, she shot to her feet, pointed at Anne, and spoke in a voice filled with hatred. You have betrayed this family. You are throwing this country into chaos because of your own jealousy. But Anne did not react as if she had been insulted. She stood up slowly with a quiet majesty, like an echo of Queen Elizabeth in her youth. She looked directly at Camilla and spoke each word with absolute clarity. No, I protect it. I protect the throne. I protect my brother from your exploitation. Those words cut through the room like a blade. One of the king's advisors drew a sharp breath and rose to his feet, daring for the first time in years to speak plainly to his majesty. He bowed slightly and said, Your Majesty, this is no longer a family matter. This is a matter of royal security. Charles opened his eyes. He looked at each face in the room and saw the truth he had avoided for so long, standing right in front of him. The silence stretched until the ticking of the wall clock could be heard. Then another member rose, his voice trembling, yet firm. He said that if they did not act today, the entire public image of the monarchy would be destroyed by the manipulation of someone who had no legitimate place in the line of authority. Camilla tried to interrupt, insisting that she had only been protecting the king during his moments of weakness. She said everything she had done came from loyalty, but no one believed those words anymore. A woman known for her caution in the council stood up and said bluntly, Loyalty never comes with control. No one is allowed to command the king. At last, all eyes turned to Charles. Everyone knew the final decision still had to come from him. Charles lowered his head for a long moment as if battling it between his personal feelings and the responsibility of a monarch. When he finally looked up, his eyes had changed. They were no longer clouded. They carried the clarity of someone who had finally understood what must be done. The king spoke with a voice that trembled, but remained steady. He said that power within the monarchy could not reside in the hands of someone who had not been entrusted with responsibility. He admitted that he had moments of weakness, and for that reason he must allow the council to make the decisions necessary to protect the throne. The council immediately issued 3 major resolutions. The first was to remove Camilla's authority in political matters, which meant she would no longer be present in strategic meetings and would not be allowed to offer input or exert influence over any royal policy. The second was to place Camilla under public oversight, ensuring that every step she took and every statement she made would be monitored and reported directly to higher authority. The third resolution left the room utterly silent. Camilla was barred from accessing royal finances, including reserve funds, art assets, and any expenditures related to the palace. Camilla dropped into her chair, her face pale, her hands trembling. For the first time in many years, she no longer had control over anyone in the room. No one looked at her with fear anymore. Only disappointment and caution remained. Charles rose to end the session, but his voice was barely strong enough to echo within the room. He did not look at Camilla. It was not anger. It was disappointment. A disappointment deeper than any scolding could ever express. As he turned to leave, every member of the council stood up. Anne was the last. Before stepping out, she looked at Camilla one final time. It was not the look of a victor. It was the look of someone who had just saved something far greater than herself. When the door closed, a long silence fell across the room like a full stop marking the end of Camilla's era of influence. In the days following the Privy Council session, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace changed so dramatically that everyone felt it, from the footmen to the guards, from the dining staff to the king's private secretaries. They all whispered the same sentence. Charles had returned. Gone was the image of a hesitant, wavering, and dependent monarch. He walked with firmer steps. Each of his movements carried a new strength, as though the invisible weight he had carried for so long had finally been lifted. At the first public engagement after the upheaval, Charles appeared before the crowd with a presence that astonished everyone. He stepped onto the podium and, for the first time in months, did not glance at Camilla for signals or approval. His voice was deep, clear, and full of resolve. The audience seemed drawn into every word he spoke. Some courtiers later said they quietly wiped tears from their eyes because they felt as if they were seeing the Charles of his younger years, full of vitality, confidence, and ideals. Only now he was the king, reclaiming himself. Anne stood behind a doorway watching every move her brother made. When Charles finished speaking, she smiled. It was not a smile of triumph. It was the smile of someone who had watched her brother return to himself after being overshadowed for so long by the darkness of manipulation. She did not need to step into the spotlight to receive credit. Anne simply stood there in silence, knowing her efforts had not been in vain. The most tense moment came during an evening that seemed completely ordinary. A family dinner in the private royal dining room. The dishes arrived with perfect timing as always, but no one truly focused on the meal. They were all waiting for what was about to happen. Charles entered with a calm face and a relaxed yet firm demeanor. Camilla sat in her usual place, but tonight she no longer radiated confidence or control. Her eyes avoided everyone, especially the king. The dinner passed in an unbearable silence. The sound of cutlery touching plates echoed faintly, making the atmosphere feel even heavier. When the dessert was served, Charles set the wine glass in front of him and gently lifted it. Every gaze turned to him. He looked at Camilla for a very brief second, then turned to Anne. His voice was low yet carried across the entire room. Anne, thank you for helping me find my voice again. That sentence sliced through the silence like a razor-sharp blade. Anne bowed her head slightly in response, without adding anything else because sometimes understanding and loyalty need no words. Camilla, at that moment, said nothing. She tightened her grip on the napkin and lowered her face. No one in the room needed to speak what everyone already knew. The power she had held for so long had dissolved. Not because of a single decision, but because of accumulated mistakes and manipulations brought into the light of truth. Camilla understood she was no longer the one who decided everything in this palace. Her silence was not submission. It was acceptance that her era of influence had ended. From that moment on, everything in the royal family began to change. No longer did Charles glance at Camilla before making even the smallest decision. No longer did cold corrections echo through the corridors whenever the king made a minor error. Charles's closest advisors returned to their previous roles, no longer pushed aside by Camilla's influence. Internal meetings were attended by those who truly held responsibility, not by unfamiliar names brought in by Camilla. Anne kept her distance and did not interfere too deeply because she knew Charles needed to stand on his own. But every time she walked past his office, she paused for a few seconds as if to make sure he was all right. And every time she saw exactly what she hoped to see, a king fulfilling his role with a confidence he had lost long ago. Camilla, though still holding her royal title, appeared far less frequently at public events. She was closely monitored under the Privy Council's ruling and no longer had access to political or financial arenas. Whispered conversations about the collapse of her power spread quickly through the palace. Everyone remained polite, but it was clear everything had shifted. The respect she once commanded now existed only in form. Everyone in the palace felt that a new era was beginning. An era in which Charles was no longer controlled by invisible influence. An era in which traditional values were restored. An era in which Anne, though she would never claim credit, stood behind the scenes keeping the family from falling apart. And when Charles once again walked down the long corridor toward his office, he stopped in front of his mother's portrait. No one knew what he was thinking in that moment, but perhaps he was reminding himself that the throne is not power, it is duty, a duty he had only just reclaimed. And when all the doors closed, the story between Anne and Camilla did not end with tense confrontations or schemes hidden behind the cold stone walls of the palace. It revealed something deeper, that power within the monarchy always carries two opposing faces. There are those who choose to stand in the shadows to protect the throne with loyalty and reason, and there are those who try to control it, shaping it to their own desires even at the cost of the family's trust. Anne never sought glory. She only wanted to keep the monarchy standing against the undercurrents threatening to pull it apart. As for Camilla, even stripped of her power, she left behind a question that made the entire palace wary. Is this truly the final end of her ambition? Or is it merely a step back before another silent battle begins? That question still lingers like a reminder that in the royal palace, peace has never been permanent.